Hi guys, I am happy to introduce you to my friend Ginger. Ginger Jacinic is a former student of mine who is now a good friend, and she is going to talk to me and to you guys about implicit bias. So Ginger, would you start by just introducing yourself and telling these guys about you?
Yeah. I'm Ginger. So like Diane said, I'm a former student of hers. So I was actually her student as an undergrad and a graduate student, and also her TA when I was in graduate school. So I spent 6 years at UT as a student. I have 4 degrees from 3 departments. Um, I currently work in strategic planning at Austin Energy, and Austin Energy is owned by the city, so we're a city department, which is really fun. I'm trying to think what else. I am licensed, right? Like I am an LMSW. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's me. We'll talk about me a fair amount as we go kind of through the presentation.
All right, I will pull up then your first slide.
Okay. So this is a little bit more about who I am. So I'm a proud social worker, and so even though I don't have a social work title and I don't work in a traditional social service organization, I'm still very, very clear about being a social worker to basically everyone I talk to. So I'm a Longhorn 4 times over. So I have a bachelor's of social work, a master's of social work, a bachelor's in women's and gender studies, and then an MPAT from LBJ. So I currently have an IT title, which is kind of strange. I work for the Chief Technology Officer at Austin Energy, even though I work just on strategic planning, but that function is under our CTO, and we're actually working kind of on my title at the moment. So at some point I may not have an IT title, but for now I do, and I have worked in IT before. Like I said, work in strategic planning. Most of my background, with the kind of few dips into IT, is in equity, social justice, community organizing, and advocacy. The identities I hold that are at least most readily apparent. So I am white. I'm young meaning younger than 30, so I'm 28. I'm a lesbian and I identify as queer. I'm also cisgender. I don't have any visible disabilities. I'm wealthy by a lot of standards, including my own, and a lot of that has to do with the money I make in my own right, and all of the education that I've obtained. But also, I married pretty wealthy as well, and I'm religiously agnostic, which is definitely worth noting, I think, in Texas. So, can I advance it, or do you advance it?
I can advance
Okay.
it.
Yeah, here we are. Okay, so my identity determines and shapes, right? So my background, my culture, my environment, and my experiences, right? And so all of those kind of key pieces, those key components of who I am, right? It determines a lot about what what my life was like growing up, what cultures, what traditions, what foods, what festivals, right, have meaning for me, the environment I live in, the people I surround myself with, the experiences I'm likely to have in life, right? Our identities determine, right, and shape who we are kind of really from start to finish. Okay. So in other words, so who I am determines the lens through which I see and experience the world. So what is bias? So bias is a preference for or against basically anyone or anything. They can be held by individuals, groups, institutions, or systems, and they can be positive or negative, right? And result in positive or negative outcomes. So this is one of my favorite slides in this deck. So talking about the nuances between conscious versus unconscious versus implicit bias, right? It can get really tricky and you kind of get lost in all of these like huge words that can feel like they're the same. So conscious or explicit bias describes kind of the preferences and attitudes that we have that we are very aware of, right? So I think for a lot of us here, right, we have a strong preference for Texas and things Texas related as Texans ourselves, right? We're all pretty aware of that one. So our unconscious bias refers to the biases that we have. We definitely have them, but we're not aware of. And these are often thought of as being out of our control. I'm kind of doing air quotes as I say that. And then implicit bias refers to unconscious bias, so the things we have that we're not aware of. But that word implicit shifts the responsibility to us, because once we are aware that that biases are not always explicit, that you can have bias that you're not aware of, we are then responsible for identifying those and mitigating them, so that our behavior is different, right? So it's this way of saying there's really no such thing as kind of unconscious bias, quote unquote, because once you know, right, and I think we are, at least as a society, moving in that direction. Once you know that you don't have, right, you have biases that you're aware of and you have biases that you're not aware of, right, you are then responsible for identifying what you're not aware of and making sure that you're taking steps to mitigate that, so that you're not out in the world acting like a complete troll.
Nice.
Okay. So why do we have biases, right? Like, why are these things that we have? So basically the answer is that because our brains are really big, but also slow. So at any given moment, the human brain is taking in millions of pieces of information through our five senses, right? What we're seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, all the time. But only about 40 to 200 pieces, depending on what types of information is coming in, can be processed at a time. So our brain makes shortcuts to efficiently process all of that information that's coming in, those millions of pieces, right, that we just don't have time to sort through. Yeah. Okay. So here are some types of bias, and these are all specific to me. But I feel like it's better to kind of give examples. So, and we can talk about these more at the end. So confirmation bias is one of the ones that where we look for information that confirms our beliefs. So I believe people raised in the South are more polite than people raised in the North, right? And then I look for examples in the world to confirm my belief, right? I'm working on that one, y'all. Okay, so in-group bias, so is where you have a preference for people who are, or people you perceive to be like you. So Austin Energy, which is where I work, has a strong preference for engineers, as most utilities do. We specifically have a strong preference for engineers from Texas A&M University. So coincidentally, the largest vertical team in our organization was previously led by an engineer who got his degree from Texas A&M, and it's really, really affected. And I'm not saying right here that there, like there's something wrong with Texas A&M engineers, but it definitely begs the question, are there competent people who were qualified for those jobs that had engineering degrees from other organizations, other institutions of higher ed, or maybe they weren't engineers, but they had, other relevant credentials, right? And we have this in-group bias to where everybody was educated in one kind of school of thought, right? And what is the impact of that on our business, on our organization? And because we're community owned, like, what is the impact on the community? And so then the last one of the others I put on just on this slide is attribution bias. So this describes judging ourselves by our intentions and then others by their actions. And like the best example of this, right, is and everybody who has driven in Austin, Texas know this. So if I swerve to avoid something on the road and accidentally cut something off, that was necessary so, right, nobody died. Now, if I'm driving and someone cuts me off, they're a butthead and they don't know who to drive and they should go back to California. Am I right?
Right. You're absolutely
right. Yeah. We're even at UT, right? Like we all do that, like when we're walking. Yes. If I'm walking across the street, you are stopping. Now, if I'm driving, I'm going to run you over and you better move.
Exactly.
Right? Like that is the best examples of attribution bias. Okay. All right, so these are some everyday examples of bias. So, right, like as a Texan, I am positively biased towards other Texans. So secular education. So this is, so, and again, these are mine, right? Like these, I did not just pull these out of thin air, y'all. So secular education. So I believe people educated in religious environments are less capable of objective reasoning. Now, y'all, I know in my logical brain, right, in my frontal lobe, that is not true. But I also know that I have that bias, having obtained all of my higher education from a public institution without a religious affiliation. I definitely run up against that, right? And it's not an issue until it is, right? Until I'm the one that's reviewing a stack of resumes, I'm the hiring manager, right? And I'm seeing people who were educated at religious institutions, and people make those choices for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they got a scholarship, maybe they had a program that somebody else didn't have, right? Like maybe they were a legacy student, like all sorts of reasons people choose to get their education from the places they choose to get it, right? But we have to be aware of what our biases are doing. So I'm a white lady. So as a white woman, others are positively biased towards me because I am perceived as non-threatening. Now I am a scary lesbian, right? Like so scary. But, right, like that's a separate thing. Like when I'm walking down the street, generally speaking, I'm perceived as being non-threatening, right? People don't cross to the other side of the street to get away from me because of the biases that they have, right? Generally speaking, there's a positive bias towards white women. All right, Jeep owners. Okay, y'all. I have this very specific narrative in my brain about who owns a Jeep and who does not. Like, if someone is out there driving Jeep, I know exactly what kind of person that is, right? Like loud, rude, inconsiderate, conservative, possibly stupid, single-handedly ruining the environment, like you name it, I've got that bias. I don't know where that one came, I think I know where that one came from, but it's definitely gotten stronger over the years. So millennial. So I often make the mistake of assuming baby boomers will not or cannot use new technologies to solve problems. That is not true, right? There are definitely baby boomers that cannot, but also, right, it's a fallacy to think that, because in fact some baby boomers actually created the technology that I use every day, right? Like these things did not just invent themselves when millennials started getting born. All right, and as a cat person, I often find that dog people are biased against me because they believe I do not like dogs, which I think is kind of weird because I absolutely love dogs. I just like them slightly less than cats. So like, but you know, that is a real bias, right? There's this understanding that you can be a cat person or a dog person. I happen to be a cat person, therefore I must hate dogs. No. Okay. So these are some big examples of bias. And so one of them is from orchestra auditions. And this example, I think, actually changed the way their auditions are done now. So in the 1970s, the Boston Symphony Orchestra realized women were underrepresented in their first chair positions, had been underrepresented in first chair positions, and they couldn't figure out why. So they implemented blind auditions, thinking that would increase the number of women in first chair positions. So they did so, right? So they put up a curtain, nobody talked to anybody else, and yet there was no change in the number of women selected, right? And so why was that? So normally, right, if I were teaching this in person, I would kind of throw that out to the room, but for those of you that were band students or orchestra students, right, if you know what concert black is, right, concert black is what folks generally wear on stage when they're performing, when they're auditioning, when they're performing in that world. So one of the big differences, right, even in concert black, right, is that generally folks who are wearing suits wear flat shoes, and those folks generally tend to identify as male, and then folks who identify as women typically wear right? Long skirts, long pants, and high-heeled shoes. So what happened when the Boston Symphony Orchestra implemented these blind auditions, even though they put up the curtain and nobody was talking, when a woman would enter the audition room and the sound of her high-heeled shoes on the floor triggered an implicit bias and everybody scoring her, and then women were not scored as highly and did not end up making up those first chair positions. So eventually the Boston Symphony Orchestra realized what was going on and then decided to have everybody take off their shoes before entering the room, and that was effective in getting rid of the bias and mitigating it, and women finally made up a representative number of first chair positions. But it just goes to show you, right, like what triggers our bias can be so small, right? And it doesn't ever have to cross kind of the consciousness of your mind, right? It's not like anybody said, oh, right, thought to themselves, oh wait, I hear high-heeled shoes, therefore that must be a woman, therefore I must score her lower, right? Like, and probably in most cases that absolutely didn't happen. Somebody just heard the high-heeled shoe unconscious, right? Like some part of their brain recognized that as somebody who probably identified as female and then scored them lower. All right, so the other example up here, the UX research, is definitely a more modern example, a newer one. So in the early 2010s, YouTube launched an app so users could upload videos directly from their phones, right? And so I'm sure a lot of folks have definitely probably used that feature. So roughly 10% of the videos were uploading upside down when they did the app launch. So why do you think that is? So interestingly, so normally I would ask folks, like how many of you are left-handed? Probably about 10% of you would raise your hands, right? So what happened in this case is all of the developers on that app team were right-handed. So when left-handed users started using the feature when the app went live, their videos were uploading upside down because the way that folks who are right-handed and the way that folks who are left-handed actually hold and use their phones is different. But because there was no one who was left-handed who had that lived experience on that user experience research team, that was something that was left out of the design. And so this is a question that comes up a lot for app design, product design, right, all across the world. Now, YouTube and Google have definitely experienced it quite a bit just because of the scale at which they do take on these types of projects. But it makes you wonder that as we move forward with artificial intelligence and virtual reality experiences, if the people who are designing those applications, those softwares, those products, and they are not representative of users, right? Like who is getting left out of that like technology space? Who gets to participate and who doesn't?
And I think there's been a very recent example of that with Amazon and starting to use Alexa and more people using things like Siri. Those apps, that kind of artificial intelligence was designed to listen to people speaking broadcast English with very little or no quote unquote accent. Although when we leave our country, they think we have an accent. And so Black people, people from other countries have always had a hard time.
Yeah.
Particularly people for whom English is a second language.
Yeah, even folks who are designing sensors, right? Like for faucets, right? There's been a lot of news articles that have come out saying faucets and facial recognition technology and anything to do with recognizing kind of human movement, right? They are not designed to pick up the movement of folks of color, right? They're not designed to pick up, right? Like when a person of color is holding their hands in front of a faucet, right? Or trying to unlock their phone, right?
And it doesn't happen.
Right, or it doesn't happen, right? And so it's like been very apparent who made up those design teams.
Who designed the parameters, yes.
Right, who designed the parameters, right, and also who they who was doing user testing, what users were included
All
in
the way down
testing,
the
and what,
line.
right, like it's a big process.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are definitely more examples of that. So in terms of approaching bias, right? So especially our implicit bias, those things that we're kind of carrying around with us that we might not even know we have. One of the most kind of basic things, but also one of the hardest things to do, right, is just to practice empathy. And remember that empathy is not passive. So putting ourselves in someone else's shoes helps us build feelings of connection. It's what helps us kind of feel that human to human pull. Right. And I think it helps to think of, right, this thought that I have, right? So like, let's take me, right? So if I'm carrying around this bias that I do know I have, right? But I didn't always know that I have it about, right, kind of against folks who were educated in religious institutions, right? But what if that is someone who made that choice because that was the only school that was located close to home and they had to live at home, or that was the only place they got financial aid to go, or all of these other very valid reasons, right? And I'm kind of excluding them because I don't believe just right off the bat that they're capable of secular reasoning, right? Like, what does that feel like, right? That can't feel good. It feels bad, and it feels like I'm being, discriminated against because of something I can't control. I mean, I think it's that process of putting yourself in someone else's shoes and saying, if I behave this way, right, or if I make this choice or I carry around this belief, right, from someone else's perspective, what does that feel like? It's a very, very powerful way to mitigate our own biases. So fostering curiosity. So curiosity, right, is in this context is, right, trying to learn something about someone or something. Part of the reason this is so helpful, right, it's not just because it feels good and fun, it's because it engages your prefrontal cortex, the part of our brains that includes executive reasoning and function. And then it's what helps us see and then mitigate our biases, right? We're not accessing that part of our brain that has those shortcuts, that's made those quick split decisions, trying to learn something about someone else and actually being curious, even if the curiosity comes from a place of trying to find similarities, right? These are the conversations. It's like, well, like, are you from Texas, right? Like, I'm from Texas. Do you have children, right? Like, I don't, like all of those kind of conversations, even if you feel like the end goal is to find similarities, right? The actual motions of it, right? And just trying to stay curious and be open to the answers literally engages a different part of your brain. All right. And then also, with both of these things, make sure you find a balance. Empathy without curiosity becomes way too much about the other person, and then curiosity without empathy becomes way too much about you, right? It becomes very me focused, and my need for information and my need for comfort and understanding and familiarity. So just make sure that you're staying open and also recognizing when you're slipping too far to one side or the other. Okay. So helpful insights. So these are from my kind of personal experience, and also teaching, and now having spent some time in the workforce. So identifying and interrupting bias requires courage, right? So to stay in that place of empathy and curiosity, right, feels very, very scary, right? And courage is not necessarily right what we think of as bravery. I think a lot of folks who are familiar with Brene Brown are now resident famous social worker, even though I heard she's teaching at McCombs, but I guess they need her more than we do.
They certainly do.
They do. But anyway, so courage is actually vulnerability, right? Like, so taking that step to be curious and to be empathy, right? Which often I feel like results in us realizing we're wrong, is really just leaning into that vulnerability and that place of discomfort. And then the second kind of big insight is, right, just knowing that you'll probably get this wrong a lot, and that's okay. So keep practicing and help the other folks around you when you see or hear someone say something and you automatically know, like you really know, like the way they said it, or just like the way their body language was communicating when they said, right, you know it was implicit, you know they're not aware of it yet, right? Like pull them aside and say, hey, you know, I don't think you were aware of this, but you know, I want to ask you where that came from, right? And you don't have to say, like, you know, wag your finger in somebody's face and say you have an implicit bias and you need to check yourself. Don't do that. That's probably not going to result in anything good. But ask somebody, right? The same way we ask ourselves when we come across our implicit bias, you need to ask somebody, where did that come from? Because people have experiences, right? They have identities and experiences that are hard, that, you know, it's hard experiences that have been challenging, that have been oppressive, right? That have been building up on each other, right? And folks may have very real reasons for having those biases that they're carrying around, reasons that they haven't been addressed yet, and being accusing or pushing with it is not going to result in anything positive, right? I think asking questions from a place of empathy and curiosity with other people the same way you would yourself, right, is how you really are helpful in helping someone else unpack all of that bias. All right.
All right. Thank you. That was super informative. I'm going to change us back so that people can see us.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
You again. And I wanted to add a couple of insights just from my own experience also managing my biases is that...
Oh, what are yours? I want to know.
Oh, you want to know what my biases
know some
are. So I have some biases about short people.
Yeah, okay. So I know y'all can't see, but we're both, are you 6'1" or 6 foot?
I'm 6 foot.
So I'm 6'1". So
yeah.
like we're tall people over here.
Very tall.
I agree.
And right. I come from a very tall family, and I was the shortest one in my family, and I'm always very surprised when people are tiny, and it causes all kinds of things to happen inside of me, like, oh my God, look at this cute tiny person. Yeah. I can't, that isn't very respectful.
Like my wife.
Yeah, or whatever. So there's that.
My wife is 5'2.5".
Yeah, she is, and she's adorable. Then there's the part of me that just wants to go, look, I'll put you in my pocket. That isn't really, you know, then Courtney gives me the look like, hey, I'm a whole person here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel you. Yeah. I feel you.
So that's one. When I first took the Harvard implicit bias test, like almost everybody else I know, I tested with a bias towards white faces in the race thing. And people often are surprised that you don't default to your own race, but all of us were raised in the same culture where white people were supposed to be better than us.
Yeah.
Right? So if you look at the doll test or any of those things, it comes out. And I thought, God, I would really love to change that. And I'm not entirely sure how to do it. Right? And so I had to ask myself those questions, like, where did that bias come from? And I know that part of it came from the age of 5 until now, which is forever. I lived in predominantly white spaces. My parents were in school. We lived in married student housing. My parents are highly educated. We lived in wealthier parts of town where it was mostly white people. And so that was about exposure to that, and having that be my cultural norm was very much a part of that. But also I read a lot of like British fiction and other kinds of dystopian things, and the main characters and the people who wrote them were all white.
Yeah.
I was taking in a lot of those values and associating them with those folks. So there's that. And it actually, the way that I changed that was I stopped spending all of my time in the dominant culture, right? I cut back on doing those things, and then I increased my exposure to the African American culture and spent more time as a part of that culture. In terms of making friends, where I worked, where I played, really making some conscious efforts, and like what I watched for entertainment, books that I read. And very gradually over time, that actually did shift to where I no longer had that bias. And so it is possible to make those things change.
Yeah, I don't have that bias.
I
When I
believe.
took, yeah, when I took the Harvard business or the Harvard implicit bias thing, and also I think because probably the last time I took it was in graduate school, but I think because I grew up in on the east side of San Antonio, like the inner east side, in a predominantly Black and brown community,
Yeah,
and also like relatively on the fringe anyway. Like my
exactly.
fringe moments still come out as an adult. I didn't test that one.
Exactly. And that,
Uh,
I think that just proves the point, which is it's not about my skin color or your skin color. It's what we saw as the positives that were around us when we were kids, and we didn't make any choices about those. They
yeah,
just were there, you know?
yeah. It's interesting too because like even as an adult, I still find that comes out in unexpected ways. So I was having a conversation with my one of my sisters about to like so there's like all sorts of like fitness stuff going
Yeah.
on, right?
Yeah,
And
lots of
in the midst of COVID and all of that, and this
you
like
should exercise.
yeah, and like and body stuff because you can control it, and you know, just like my perceptions of beauty have always been different than the norm, which I didn't even realize until I was a student at UT, until I left
Yeah.
San Antonio and kind of left the communities that I had grown up in, right? Because it's so interesting because my wife, who grew up like in very white areas and very rich suburbs, in very wealthy parts of Texas, has very, like, you know, has always, I think, spent a lot of time around people that look like me, and right, and is kind of baffled by this like idea, right? Like I wasn't, you know, I wasn't pretty and popular in high school, which I didn't look like this either, but right, you know, like,
Or
but
as
right,
an
like,
undergrad.
but like it also like I just like was not the right, I like just wasn't the standard,
Right.
right, of like beauty then, right, really wasn't until I got to higher ed, where there's just a lot more white people than I'd ever seen, probably ever in my entire life, all together, you know, that like I even realized there was kind of a different standard, you know, and I realized that, you know, my sisters and I talk about like how even now like what we find attractive in partners and
Mm-hmm.
like our own, you know, like what we think of as like beautiful and aesthetically pleasing are so different.
Yeah. So different. It's super interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about how you've assimilated to your workplace. I know that's super interesting. And because you are like cisgen white,
Yeah.
attractive, people are surprised when they get to know you.
Yes. Yeah, so it's been a lot. So I didn't used to look like this, is the first thing. So you know, I was again, I was saying to someone, um, you know, one of my friends was like, somebody I'm pretty close with was like, "You're so pretty." I was like, "Thank you, I bought it."
Yeah.
Right, but like I did, right? And so when I was kind of getting towards the end of schooling and spending more time like in workplaces, even though I wasn't necessarily always being paid for that work, I was having a hard time. Like people didn't like that my hair was so short and was like that short, and it was cute all the time. Um, and people don't like my piercings, and I actually took out, I think I counted it once, it was like 5 or 6 piercings
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
before
Oh, I
my
remember.
my first Skype interview with
It
the
was
city.
intense, man.
Yeah, it was. And it was so hard because I felt like my queerness was so tied to my clothes and my hair and my piercings and stuff. And I was torn because I'm like, I really, really, really want to do this work, right? I really want to work for the city. I really want to work in public service, right? And I really feel like there was a lot of opportunity for me to do that, opportunities that a lot of people don't get, right? And I was like, you know, am I willing to play this game? And I decided that I was, but I struggled, y'all. Oh my God, I struggled.
Me too.
And you know, and even now, like there are moments where it's just so incongruent. So like I feel like I have really simulated, like so much so as not to trigger other people's biases that I know that they have. But even now, like, so I have tattoos like on my forearms and like on my upper arms and stuff. And even now in the springtime when it gets warmer and I wear sleeveless shirts to the office, y'all, I swear, like some of the people in higher up positions in my organization will literally cross to the other side of the hallway. Even though I work in strategic planning, I'm the only full-time person working on strategic planning for the whole utility, even though I work with lots of other people. But I'm like, everybody like knows who I am, like is familiar with my work. But it's like when these tattoos come out, it's like, oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, or like I often notice like when people are having conversations like around the holidays and stuff about like what they're doing, right? It's always this we, like we're going here, we're going there, right? And you know, I'm careful with how I choose my language and saying like Courtney and I are going, you know, to the mountains for Christmas, or right, or I'll just use the we, right? Like, right, like y'all can just figure that out. I've had the conversation. I've been asked to speak on a couple of panels around the city too. Like one of the things I say is, you know, I really don't love the word lifestyle, right? Like I don't think the word lifestyle has done anything good for anybody in the queer community.
It was horrible.
It's a horrible word. However, when we're talking about literal lifestyle, right? Like, am I saying that like there's no difference in how I live my life as a young queer woman than how a lot of straight cis people live their life? You know, like actually, like there's right, like my relationship doesn't look like straight cis people's. Like it doesn't. My friendships don't look like that. My community doesn't look like that. My weekends, like. You know, like it doesn't look like that, right? Like that's just not how it works. And so like juggling that in the workplace is really, really interesting, right? On top of all of the other things, like I am often the youngest person in rooms and in meetings by decades, right? Like not by a few years, like decades.
By decades, yeah.
Which again is fine until there's this like just, you know, something very like clash. You know, and it just, you're like, oh man, like this is just completely collided. And so even though I've done so much, right? Like I bought pretty teeth, I've bought pretty skin, I've like grown out my hair, I've like really upped my work, like up to here, y'all, really upped the wardrobe game, right? Like, it's hard, you know, like sometimes it's like, you can do all of those things, but we all need to address these implicit biases because you still run into them and we still have them and we still carry them around, and the ones we all have about everyone else still impact them.
It does every time. And I when I was really young and my hair was really short and I wore much more gender neutral clothing because of my height and my size, people often thought I was a guy, which was
all the time.
Fantastic. It was lovely.
Don't wear men's shoes on the regular.
Always. But whether people thought I was a man or a woman, they always knew I was Black.
Yeah.
Right. And people are a lot more afraid of Black men than they are of Black women. Yeah. And so, you know, somebody would say something to me, they obviously thought I was a guy, and I would then start talking and they would realize I was a woman, and I could see them relax.
Oof.
Like I suddenly had become less threatening to them because of my perceived gender. And it was so in some ways very painful, just because I thought, God, that my brother lives with that all the time, every single day,
Yeah.
all the time. Now in professional life, I, did what you did. I bought more traditional, packaged myself a little bit differently. But there are things you can't hide from other folks either.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So
The one
it's
time,
very interesting.
yeah, no, the one time I experienced anything like that, I was studying abroad in London when I was still at UT. And generally speaking, when Americans travel abroad, we carry a lot of American markers with us, right? Just consciously and unconsciously. That after I had been there for a number of weeks, I like struck out on my own one afternoon. Like I wasn't with any of my classmates or anything. I was just kind of running errands, and it was like after it was like one evening. Right, and at the time I had very short hair, and I bought some clothes because I was there for quite like 4 or 5 weeks. So I bought some clothes from there, and I was on the tube, like on the subway, and people were reacting to me very strange.
Yeah.
Like they were shifting away from me and kind of looking at me with like side eye. And I was like, what is
happening?
Yeah. And so like the worst, like when I was getting off of the subway and like going towards the staircase to get right above ground. And like I noticed like people grabbing like their children and their purses. And I was like, what on earth is like going on? And I was like thinking about it like the whole way home, and I was like talking to my host family about it. And they were like, did you have like any of your American stuff with you, your bags, your whatever? And I was like, no. And they're like, did you talk to anybody? I was like, no. And they're like, they just thought you were a gypsy. Yeah. And I was like, what? And they're like, you are so like classically like Eastern European, Slavic. They're like because I was wearing maxi skirts were like really in, and it was cold, so I was like wearing a maxi skirt over my tights. They're like, yeah, they were all afraid like I was literally gonna rob them. Yeah. And I was just like, oh my God, this is like what? No, y'all. I was like, so I actually called my best friend. I was like, I am like, this what you feel like every time you walk into a store? Every time. Yeah. Every time. And I was like, how do people live like this? But I had an experience with this class. I had a young man who is Roma and comes from that culture and was doing a study abroad. And he said that one of the strangest things about being in Texas, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how did you end up in Austin, Texas from Eastern Europe? Oh, that must be really shocking. And he said the most shocking thing is that people were not afraid of him. Yeah. Like that there was no tag around being Roma or being a gypsy, that he was a constant part of his life. Yeah. When he was at home. It was so weird. And without my American markers or without my classmates to talk to, right? So people could hear my English and hear my accent. There was no marker. It was just me and my face. Yeah. So, but I think these are great examples of how bias, particularly implicit bias that we don't recognize, affects our feeling of either belonging somewhere or not belonging somewhere without us even knowing that that's what has happened until later. When we think back on it and go, why did I feel so uncomfortable, or why were people treating me this way? So it's a very interesting topic, and I so appreciate you being willing to chat with us about it. I do. So I'm gonna sign off. Bye guys. See you later. Thank you, Miss Ginger. And somehow I will figure out how to stop recording. There it is.